think this sounds like an inspirational bumper sticker, but I do genuinely not feel any different about my prepping and my performing of an audition versus a recital, except I don't get to choose the music, and they're very small parts of a whole. That is the most key aspect of audition preparation and performance.
1 year ago, almost to the day, I was taking what you're hearing today, that quote from Robin Kesselman, principal bass of the Houston Symphony, and thoughts from dozens of other prominent double bassists, and I was synthesizing all of this into a book that I put out called Winning the Audition. You can check it out at winningtheaudition.net. It's expanded out from this set that you're about to hear of 4 podcast highlights. So in the spirit of these couple of weeks of best of the podcast, best of the most recent generation of the podcast, the last couple of years, I thought it'd be good to take Winning the Audition, this series that kind of got me thinking about how there's value beyond the individual conversations of this podcast. I thought it'd be great to take all 4 of those episodes that I originally put out and put them into one, so you can just have one link, one URL you can go to, one podcast episode you can listen to. So that's what you're hearing today. And we have some great sponsors on board. We're having shifting sponsors as we go, so we've got some different sponsors than when this series came out, but I'm leaving in the sponsorship for this series, one sponsor for this series, and it's a great company you need to know about. It is Discover Double Bass. Jeff Chalmers, he's become a great colleague and friend, and I am actually finally interviewing Jeff. We're going to sit down and talk music, business, why double bass lessons online, what he's learned in the process, how his career has evolved. So that's coming up soon after I get back from my Mexico and Southern California journeys. So again, this whole series was originally sponsored by Discover Double Bass. Check them out at discoverdouble.bass.com. And I'd like to thank the sponsors we've got on board right now in late 2017. And those folks are Robertson & Sons, the Bass Violin Shop, D'Addario Strings, and A440. We'll be hearing more from them later. And I am going to just put out these 4 episodes back to back. There's a little bit of introductory info in each one. That's okay. And I think between episodes 3 and 4 or 2 and 3, I guess I must have just been getting tired when I was doing them. I do believe that I duplicated a Robin Kesselman quote between 2 of these episodes. It's a good quote, worth hearing multiple times. If you catch it, send me an email, feedback@Contrabass Conversations, and let me know. And I'll put them out on altered, unedited, but I'll give you a little bit of commentary. I've talked to so many more audition winners since this series. It's pretty incredible, actually. And I've got some in the can ready to put out after I get back from Mexico. So between the episodes, you'll hear a little contemporary Jason and just some thoughts on this whole process. Thank you so much for tuning into this. I really hope you enjoy this complete version of Winning the Audition. Welcome to Winning the Audition, a special series from Contrabass Conversations featuring advice from leaders in the field about preparing and executing auditions successfully. This series is drawn from interviews conducted with dozens of bassists from orchestras like the Philadelphia Orchestra, Boston Symphony, Cleveland Orchestra, National Symphony, Chicago Symphony, and Houston Symphony, plus some of the major pedagogues in the field. This series provides actionable advice that you can use to take your auditioning to the next level. And while we're speaking with bassists for these episodes, this advice can certainly be applied to other instruments and disciplines as well. This series is divided into 4 episodes: Preparing for Audition Success, Practicing Techniques for Peak Auditions, Preparation Routines That Work, and Sealing the Deal. And I'd like to give a huge shout out to John Grillo, who is my co-host for several of these interviews. Now, before we dive in, let's take a look at the audition process in general and how it has changed over the past half century. Lawrence Hurst, the former bass professor at Indiana University, describes what the audition scene looked like early in his career.
I guess everybody understands that prior to about 1970, before the screens came up, that it was who you studied with that was everything. because your teacher had the access to the conductors. And they could usually make a phone call and say to whoever, whether it was a Reiner or a Schulte or whoever it was at the time, I have a great student here. You're going to be in town next week with the orchestra. Would you have a minute to hear this kid? And that's the way it was done for years.
Hurst goes on to describe the adoption of the screen in auditions and how it transformed the way bass was being taught.
Of course, I think in the 60s and so forth, in the 70s, the ferment in the country just got pressed into the orchestra business, and it was way overdue because I know at Michigan there was an African-American kid there that was a great bass player, and he couldn't find work in this country. He ended up in Nova Scotia as principal there because this country just wouldn't even let him play an audition. So that was very, very necessary. That had to happen, and I think it happened at the end of the 60s and early 70s. But once that happened, the whole technique of teaching had to go with that because you couldn't just run kids through method books anymore. You had to get them ready to be competitive in the larger field of the excerpts. I mean, when I played for the chair in Dallas, I played an hour and 45 minutes with the conductor, and of course it wasn't. I played 2 Brahms symphonies. I played 3 Mozart symphonies. And I'm talking about first and last movement and so forth. We had the time to do that. Of course, nothing was really perfect, but the conductor could get a real insight and overview of what I could do as a musician because of the time element. Of course, they can't do that now. It would be impossible to run an audition like that now. And not to mention the fairness factor and all the rest.
During this period in the 60s and 70s, the audition scene morphed into what we currently have. And over the most recent few decades, we've seen a contraction in the availability of jobs, not only in the United States, but worldwide. Marc Ramírez, principal bassist of the Gulbenkian Orchestra in Lisbon, Portugal, speaks about this phenomenon, which began in the United States, but has spread throughout Europe as well.
The music world in Europe has changed tremendously. Contracts have changed tremendously. Before, you used to get a lifetime contract, and these days you get a 3-year, 5-year renewable contract. It's much of the same. It's the same thing that's happening in the States. I mean, I read a lot. What happened in Detroit, right. What happened in Philadelphia. There's a lot of changes that are happening in terms of job security in Europe, in terms of the old school, you win the big job and then you're set for life. That now is a dream. That's, I would say, is dead now, unfortunately.
Now that we set the scene for our current employment reality, how do we acquire the skills to navigate this highly competitive process with the screen and all those modern details? What are people behind those screens looking for? Here's Rob Kassinger of the Chicago Symphony with some thoughts on what he's listening for.
The thing I always tell people about auditions is that if I'm going to sit down and listen to 100 people, which is sometimes that is how many you got to listen to, I say that you can break that number of people into 3 different groups, and the biggest group is in the middle, and there's probably 80 people at that audition who play really, really well. Not perfect, not, like the greatest player in the world, but play all the stuff in a manner that's, accurate to what's on the page. There's some musicality there, and that's like the big middle part. Then you've got maybe 10 people roughly at the low end of the spectrum who just unfortunately just shouldn't have, bothered to show up. And, there's variations on that theme, but generally there's, you can kind of tell there's some people who just may be a little bit misguided about what they're capable of doing. And then you've got, at the upper end, you've got maybe 5 to 10 people, sometimes less, who really have something special. And people always want to know, what is it that makes the special people the most special? And I really think it comes down to detail, attention to detail. There's just got to be, there has to be something more that you get when you're playing the recitative from Beethoven 9. The players who really make that excerpt work are the ones that are paying absolute attention to the details that are on the page and then making the most out of those details. But on top of all that, they've got the just ironclad rhythmic control. Their intonation is, it may not be flawless, but it's so close to being flawless that, you would just love to be sitting with this person, So, and that's really what it boils down to, rhythm, intonation, and this other category called musicality.
Attention to detail and that musical element, that musicality. How the heck do we develop that? And that's the real question, isn't it? And that's what we're going to cover in this series. Before we get going here, I'd love to let you know a little bit about our sponsor, DiscoverDoubleBass.com, which provides expert lessons and step-by-step courses. And it's run by Jeff Chalmers, who we've had on the podcast before. He was a guest on episode 172, along with Lauren Pierce, who's also a tutor on Jeff's site. Now, I dig this site. I think it's a valuable way to learn everything from the basics to really advanced techniques. And they've got free articles, they've got string reviews, they even have a show called Ask Jeff and Lauren, where they answer questions from the bass community. It's really good stuff. Jeff's doing tremendous work over there, and I highly recommend it. Be sure to check it out at discoverdoublebass.com. First, let's dive into preparation. What we do before we ever put bow to string can have a massive impact on how our auditions ultimately turn out. Andy Anderson of the Lyric Opera of Chicago has some techniques that work wonders to pave the path for success.
Every time I take an audition, I always make a booklet. I go to Kinko's, I have it bound with a clear front and a black back with a coil binding. No, spiral, not coil. I like it because the spiral turns better. It lays flat. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the first thing I do when I'm preparing an audition, usually, is make MIDI files or download MIDI files of everything on the list that's hard. And it might not be hard because it's fast. Sometimes it's just like Otello, where it's just really easy to play out of tune. The great thing is I don't think they get paid to do this. They just arrange full symphony scores for MIDI. So you have a file that has the entire score in it, not just the bass part. And you can put it on your computer and then open it using a program like Finale, and then you can tweak it to suit your needs. Like for instance, on mine, I usually put a click track to it. The greatest thing is if it's a lick I want to repeat a lot and practice and woodshed, I'll put it at a tempo, whatever tempo I can play it cleanly, and then I'll just put little repeat signs around that and make a little repeat out of it, and it'll just keep playing it for hours on end. And each time I play it, I can quickly think, what do I want to do differently? And this is kind of a very athletic approach to learning something, because each time you're doing many repetitions, and each time you're bringing it a little closer to your perfect performance. And sometimes what I'll do with it is I'll overdo accents and sforzandos and things like this, and the dynamics I'll overdo, and it forces me. I always make sure I can hear the MIDI accompaniment going on. I can hear the solo, and that's the great thing about downloading it from the site is that usually it's the full score. You can hear. You aren't just listening to the bass part. You're actually listening to what you'd hear in a live recording. It sounds kind of dorky and mechanical, but the notes are there, and you can hear the melody going on around you, and it gives you an opportunity to practice it with your own little orchestra at whatever tempo you need, in whatever chunks you want. You can tell the conductor to keep repeating these 4 measures until I get it. And that's really nice to do. And then you can tell him, and can you gradually speed this up until it's at tempo? and sure enough, all you have to do is click the mouse a couple times and it happens. I have to very meticulously program my hands. And that's how I do it. I first program my computer and try to get the computer to play it as close to the way I have it in my head. This kind of stage makeup version of it, where all the louds are loud and all the softs are really soft, and then you have these pow and punches and accents, and then you try to get the computer to do this so that every time you listen to it, you get this kind of exaggerated version of the piece that will then, when you're nervous and your arms freeze up, will still come out.
What a great way to focus on the details. Sitting down in front of the computer and adding in all of those accents, articulations, dynamics. What a valuable way to internalize those details. And the objective feedback that you get from the computer playing along with it is just so valuable. Now, Andy also manipulates actual recordings in a similar fashion.
I realized when I started preparing auditions this way that I ran the risk of producing a mechanical, kind of cartoonish version of these excerpts, with all these exaggerated things and perfect time and, ridiculous sound, ba, 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 that's not how it's supposed to sound. And so then what I also started to do is I create one set of files on the computer that's all my MIDI files for all these excerpts. And every audition I do this, and then after I get that done, and I've played through it a few times, then I start breathing life into it. And I cut up live recordings, Cleveland or San Francisco or some orchestra that's recorded a really nice, some recording of it I like. And I'll put it in iTunes, and then I'll listen to it a few times and mark where the time markings are around the excerpt. And usually I use a program now. When I was at Texas, I found this program. They had it on the computers there. And I think you've used it too, Amazing Slowdowner.
I have, yeah.
It's a fantastic program. It's like $25, less than the cost of a D string, I think. And it allows you to change the pitch and the rhythm and the tempo of a live recording independently. So, for instance, I put in all those carry-on, the
sure.
Berlin fill.
Right.
So I put in his recording, and sure enough, the A is really high. And then I put in like a Boston, and it's nice and low. It's right where it should be. And I'm thinking, it used to be that I would just have to retune for each one of these, if I wanted to play with the recording, which, I did used to do. But now what I do is I use this program, and I adjust the pitch to whatever I want. And if it's slightly faster than I can play it, like the last page of Beethoven 9, I'll slow it down a little bit so it's just fast enough that I can play it cleanly. And yet I'm still hearing all the chaos that goes on in a live recording, which is nice. And you get to the tempo changes. Sometimes I'll add a little click track using my computer's microphone to it. If, like, for instance, in a lot of Strauss tone poems, the tempo is so fluid that it's even hard to tap your finger to it to put in a click track. So sometimes I'll do that, and I'll make it more, so I still get the flexibility and the organicness of a live recording that the MIDI files definitely don't have. They're very sterile and perfect, and yet kind of boring. But the live recordings work out really well. If you find one you like and you just practice with that. I did that especially for the lyric audition because I had never played any opera, really. I hadn't. And so here I was preparing a list of material I had never worked on. And the only reason they wanted to hear me more than once is because I had done this with this material.
The Amazing Slowdowner, the program that Andy's talking about, is now also available for mobile devices. And I've used that and also a similar program on my iPhone called AnyTune Pro Plus. These are amazing apps, and they let you do everything that Andy's talking about with recordings all on the mobile device. And we'll have links in the show notes to both of these programs. Now, however you decide to do it, playing along with recordings is incredibly valuable. And here's Lawrence Hurst talking about his experiences with this technique.
When you get preparing for an orchestra audition, you should play along with recordings. I know a lot of people don't like to talk about that, but it's a wonderful way to prepare because what it does is place you in the milieu, because most committees will tell instantly if somebody's played the piece or not. It becomes so obvious to the committees who's played what, but even behind the screen. I'll give you a great example. There was a competition at the ISB convention in Kalamazoo. Was that right? Kalamazoo? I think that's where it was. And I was on the panel, and they were doing the famous lick at the fourth movement of the 40th of Mozart. You know, when it goes, which is much faster than that, of course. And so I suggested to the panel, since for the listener to catch that, it's kind of like it hits you in the face, and the listener is disoriented. It's hard for the listener to pick that out of the air, both the tempo and the piece and the notes. So I suggested that we give them 2 bars ahead, which are simple bass beats, which go bum, 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 and then they start the lick. Well, that sets the tempo, it sets the kind of style, et cetera, et cetera. So we passed it. They agreed that was a good idea. So they passed it on to the students that were auditioning. And I'm not exaggerating. At least 35 to 40% of those people couldn't play those 2 or 4 bars ahead of that lick.
A great way to implement what Mr. Hurst is describing here is to cut up recordings like Andy was describing, but with about 4 bars of material prior to the beginning of the excerpt. That gives you enough material to recognize the piece when you're practicing along with it, and it helps to solidify those prior bars in your mind so they can be a mental cue in the audition. And something that Andy and I have also talked about when prepping for auditions is to take these excerpts, put them in a playlist, and then put that playlist on shuffle. That way you're getting a totally random reordering of the excerpts. Ian Hallas, the most recent audition winner for the bass section of the lyric opera, does a similar thing.
There's a hat draw element to it where you just throw things into a bag and you pull them out and you play them no matter if you want to see it or you don't want to see it, because you never know what's going to happen.
Developing the ability to mentally switch gears is so vital, and there are a lot of resources available to help get your mental game in order for an audition. Here's what has helped Brandon Mclean, the recent audition winner for the Pittsburgh Symphony Associate Principal Bass position, with these mental aspects of auditioning.
I've read the Don Green books that I find really, really helpful, just in terms of centering and things like that. There's still some of that I do at auditions. I'm not so disciplined about it now, just because I've done it quite a bit, so I sort of know what the routine is without having to think about the routine. But really, that first time when I was able to go into an audition and feel that relaxing of my muscles right before I played, and really feeling like my energy wasn't all over the place, but I could really sort of compact that energy somewhere in my core, was really helpful.
Ira Gold of the National Symphony also talks about these books by Don Green. There are 3 of them, and they're wonderful. Audition Success, Performance Success, and Fight Your Fear and Win. And he talks about some other resources that he's found helpful in his own audition taking.
There's like a psychological aspect to performing that there's a lot of material written about it, and there's a lot of books that are out there. One of them in particular that a lot of people taking auditions have read is a book by Don Green. I think it's called Performance Success. I've read it, and a lot of people have read it, and it's really interesting. He kind of lays out, all the specifics about, what it means to have performance anxiety and why it exists and why we go through what we go through. Right. And it kind of walks you through the whole process, and I think a lot of people really enjoyed it. I'm sure you're familiar with that book. There's another book that's not directly about that, but it's called Flow. And if you just go to Google and type it in, I can't pronounce the last name of the gentleman, but his first name is spelled Mihaly. I think his last name is actually pronounced Csikszentmihalyi, but it doesn't look like that. But the book is amazing. It's basically about how we engage ourselves in certain activities that sort of take us away from our sort of normal consciousness, and we're able to really immerse ourselves in a certain activity. And he touches on artists, which include musicians and athletes, and how, if a tennis player is like in the middle of a match, how they're just so, inside the game that they're in, that they're able to, focus so much on what they're doing. And he goes, from all different directions of what that's about, and how you can develop that kind of sense just in a day-to-day life. Even people who aren't musicians or athletes, how they can experience that type of flow. And it's really interesting, and it's one of the books I always recommend to people. If they ask me, what's one of your favorite books, that's usually the first one I mention. But yeah, definitely, we all get nervous. Just because I've had success in auditions doesn't mean that I haven't felt, my heart pounding or sweat or, feel my mouth drying up. I mean, I've experienced all that, but I definitely have always felt that, it doesn't matter what I'm experiencing at that moment. I'm still Ira. I'm still playing. I'm still who I am, and I can still go out there and really try to have the best experience I can.
Those mindset qualities that Ira's talking about end up being so critical in taking an audition. And Robin Kesselman, the Houston Symphony principal bass, talks about a mindset that he has adopted for auditioning that has served him well.
I never played a perfect round, and I've never to this day played a perfect round. I don't think they exist, and also kind of not necessarily the goal.
Yeah.
Like, I think this sounds like a bumper, like an inspirational bumper sticker, but I do genuinely not feel any different about my prepping and my performing of an audition versus a recital, except I don't get to choose the music, and they're very small parts of a whole, both like one voice of a whole and one small excerpt. But I think that is the most key aspect of audition preparation and performance, is that, and having sat on audition panels here in Houston too, on several, it's a musical expression, and it's a little strange environment, and it's weird, and getting comfortable with the screen, but it has to be a musical expression and an artistic endeavor. And I think also just in the fact that, look, this is something that everybody's going to do for probably a time measured in years, and that sort of makes it potable, but also exciting and fun and rewarding, artistically rewarding. So I don't think it's not a scantron, it's like we work in a field where you don't get jobs with scantron tests or SAT tests or job interviews. I just think that even if you have to trick yourself a little bit, fool yourself a little bit, I think the more that one thinks of an audition like a recital, the better it's going to be for everybody involved.
Yeah. He also talks about how valuable it is just to have the right kind of goal in mind when you walk out on stage to play.
If you walk out and your whole goal is to play notes that are even and in tune, the second a note is a slightly different length than another note, you've officially nothing left to offer because your single goal has crumbled. Yeah. But if your goal is to make lines and make shapes and be expressive, and then one of your notes is like a little shorter than the other ones, in a kind of strokey passage, it's okay. It's like you're still completely fulfilling your purpose.
So we go back now to the very first thing that we talked about in this episode, what Rob Kassinger was mentioning with what he's listening for behind the screen. This is Ira Gold again. Now he's served on audition committees for many years, and here's what Ira has to say about what he's listening for behind the screen.
It's interesting because when I went through that process of being on the other side, even if you try not to tell yourself, oh, I'm on the other side of this now. You know what I mean? Like, because when you go and take auditions, you're so used to the experience of, okay, I know I'm going to play for a few minutes, and I know there's going to be a screen up, and it's going to be this weird kind of situation where, like, there's no interaction, and I have to talk to these pieces, and they may or may not talk to me from the other side of the screen. Like, you know what the experience is like from going through it, but when you're on the other side, it really is different. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I'm a focused person, and if someone's playing music, I think that I experience it as a listener in a similar way that I experience it when I'm playing. But I think that your responsibility is different when you're on an audition committee, because your responsibility is to try to take whatever information you can from what you're hearing and turn it into some kind of judgment that's going to be valuable to the process. So if you feel that what you're hearing is really interesting from a technical standpoint or a musical standpoint or a stylistic standpoint or acoustically, then you have to follow that and try to use that as long as you can to sort of keep that person's playing in the game. I think that there is the idea that in an audition, it's sort of like some people come to auditions and say, I'm either looking to dismiss this person by what I'm hearing or looking to accept them. And I think that I try to see it as I want reasons to accept someone's playing when I hear it. So I'm trying to find things that I like as opposed to trying to find things I don't like. By default, there will be things I don't like. But what I'm trying to do is gather as much information about what I'm drawn to and what I think is interesting so that I can say, yeah, I want to hear this person again, or wow, they did some really interesting things there. That was beautiful phrase, or whatever is coming to mind. And I think if you can't go to that point and you're like, well, I'm trying to like this, but there's intonation issues, or the sound isn't consistent, or the tempo isn't consistent, or it doesn't sound like they played this piece before, or they're not really filling the room. It seems like their dynamic range isn't really working in this hall. Whatever it is, like if you just keep feeling like you're trying to find reasons to want to hear them again, but you can't find them, then it means you probably shouldn't vote for that person.
So how do you develop those traits that make people want to hear you again? That's what we're going to cover in the next 3 episodes of this series. And I really hope you've enjoyed this first episode. I've been thinking about putting a series like this together for quite some time. This is the result of many hours of work going through the entire back catalog and listening and cataloging and thinking. And I just can't wait to get these other episodes out for you. And another shout out for our sponsor, DiscoverDoubleBass.com, for being willing to get on board with this new idea. I'm really excited about it. I hope you are too. Next episode, we'll be digging into practicing techniques for peak auditions. And this is all about various methods that people have used to take their playing up to that audition winning level. We'll follow that up with preparation routines that work, following along with several of the bass players I've talked to over the years and their path to winning their audition. We'll be hearing from Max Dimoff, Alex Hanna, Robin Kesselman, many others. And episode 4, Sealing the Deal. That's all about that extra something that people are looking for, that musical element, and how people have changed their mindset and changed their practicing to develop that. And after this audition series, I have dozens of other thematic series ideas. So stay tuned. I'm really excited to put these out for you. I hope you've enjoyed this first episode, and stay tuned for parts 2, 3, and 4 coming soon. Hello, Contemporary Jason back here. And before we get into the next parts, I do want to give a shout out to our wonderful sponsors. These folks make it possible for me to take the time and schedule out these interviews and synthesize this stuff together. If I was going to map out the hours that it took to put this Winning the Audition together, my goodness, it was a big project. So thank you so much to Robertson & Sons. For more than 4 decades, Robertson & Sons has specialized in providing the highest quality stringed instruments and bows to collectors, to professional musicians, to music educators, and to students of all ages. Their facility is outstanding. They have this beautiful recital hall. I had the privilege of trying out all sorts of instruments there. I had such a great time visiting Albuquerque and spending a day with Aaron and Don Robertson. What an inspiring experience. You need to schedule a visit to Albuquerque. It's a great town anyway, by the way. And if you are looking for a C extension, a chromatic extension, that was first developed at Robertson's. I have one of those on my bass made by Chris Threlkeld, who worked for Robertson's for many years, and I just love the design. They are one of those deceptively simple looking but quite complicated devices, and nobody does it better than Robertson's in the extension department. Check them out online, robertsonviolins.com. And thank you also to the Bass Violin Shop. They offer professional setups, repairs, and restorations at reasonable prices. They're located in North Carolina, and if you have a neck that needs resetting, a crack that needs repairing, a new fingerboard installation for your bass, new bass bar, anything like that, the Bass Violin Shop will work hard to get the most out of your instrument without blowing your budget. Okay, we are diving into part 2 of this episode, and this opening, it's the traditional Contrabass Conversations theme song, and as I had this crazy setup for editing these interviews and kind of figuring out who said what and contextualizing it, and at a certain point, I just thought, what would happen if I played them all at the same time? And that's what that massive crowd sound is. You probably figured that out, but that was one of those happy accidents. And so without further ado, enjoy this second part of Winning the Audition. Welcome to Winning the Audition, a special series from Contrabass Conversations featuring advice from leaders in the field about preparing and executing auditions successfully. This series is drawn from interviews conducted with dozens of bassists from orchestras like the Philadelphia Orchestra, Boston Symphony, Cleveland Orchestra, National Symphony, Chicago Symphony, and Houston Symphony, plus some of the major pedagogues in the field. This series provides actionable advice that you can use to take your auditioning to the next level. And while we're speaking with bassists for these episodes, this advice can certainly be applied to other instruments and disciplines as well. Our topic for this episode is practicing techniques for peak auditions. We're diving into practice methods that have worked well for many people. How we prepare for an audition has a tremendous impact on our confidence going into the audition and the results that we get. Brandon Mclean of the Pittsburgh Symphony has this to say about preparation and the concept of having a good day in an audition.
When I wasn't doing well in auditions, the fact is that, I had lost those auditions months in advance, really, just because my preparation wasn't there good enough to win the audition. And it, even if I had the best day of playing in my life, I think somebody that was more prepared, having just a mediocre day, could probably still be better at the audition than I did.
Cincinnati Symphony principal bassist Owen Lee makes it crystal clear what he's looking for when listening to auditions.
Play in tune and play in rhythm. Play the dynamics that are on the page, Play what's written on the page, the dynamics, the nuances, articulations. And then play with a good tone. If you can do all that, you'll make the finals easily if you can do those things.
Chicago Symphony bassist Michael Hovnanian has a great perspective on this also.
Most of the time, the things that eliminate people are so simple. Just the rhythm wasn't right, the intonation or something that they ought to be able to hear themselves. It's not that they didn't blow us away so they didn't get the job. It's really, they didn't count, or they rushed or they dragged or it was out of tune, some real basic.
It sounds so simple. Play in time, play in tune, play what's on the page. So why don't we all do that? Ed Barker, principal bassist of the Boston Symphony, sums it up well.
My experience with students is that they vastly underestimate how much practice it takes to accomplish this sort of thing, especially when you're preparing for something as nerve-wracking as an audition. And they'll often say, yes, no, I understand, and I'll point it out to them, and I'll draw diagrams and lessons and things, and this is what you need to do. And they shake their head, yes. And then they go play the audition, and they come back and they say, I vastly underestimated how much practice it takes.
Well, I'd like to take a moment and tell you about our sponsor, Discover Double Bass. And I'm so grateful for them sponsoring this series. They've got a video course on bowing technique with Lauren Pierce, and it's divided into 37 HD lessons. You can visit discoverdoublebass.com/store, and you can watch Lauren give an overview of the 3 categories that these videos cover. They're basics, bow control, and real-world techniques. And you also get free membership in the Discover Double Bass study group, where you can ask Lauren and Discover Double Bass founder Jeff Chalmers questions and get the help you need. You can check out more details and other great content at discoverdoublebass.com. So what specific techniques do people use in their audition preparation that work? Let's start with slow practice. Now, most of us are probably practicing slowly already, but it's interesting to hear just how far many successful audition takers go with this technique. Andy Raciti of the Milwaukee Symphony describes the benefits of slow practice quite eloquently.
One thing I learned over time was that playing things at half tempo is a really amazing way to get very, I would say, intimate with each move in any particular excerpt. If we're talking excerpts here. What I soon learned was that when I put things at half tempo, I had to make sure that I wasn't practicing different moves than what would happen at live tempo, real tempo. I had to make sure I wasn't using more bow, or I wasn't using a slower bow or anything. I was increasing the gap between each move, kind of practicing in slow motion. That was a big way to get some of this stuff to stand up when you get under pressure. When you've gotten used to observing something in slow motion and relaxed and very precise, you're telling your body over and over again, this is what it feels like to play this stuff. I think that our bodies don't really remember speed of something so much as their place in space and time. So if you play with your body in the right place and at the right rate, it's like watching sprinters practicing getting out of the block. They do it really slow because they want to see, oh, my elbow kicked out a little bit. That's going to add a microsecond to my time. Their body remembers the position more than it does the speed. And so that was a big breakthrough as far as being able to sit down and play. And even though I was playing faster, in my mind, I still felt like it was slower and relaxed. And I had the space, that hyper-awareness that you feel in an audition that often feels like a detriment. Oh my God! I just heard. You're aware of every time you blink, and oh my God, that the hair on the string moved a little bit, and I hear. It changes it from that kind of panicked, uncomfortable feeling to this extra space that you can sit in, and whatever the zone or the flow, and you actually have space to phrase or to feel this gesture and to hear this crescendo and this stuff. It's very liberating. It's a good place to be.
Our bodies don't remember speed so much as their place in time. What a great concept, and what a great way to reframe that hyper-awareness that comes over people in auditions. National Symphony bassist Ira Gold talks about what he focuses on in his slow practice.
I like to sometimes start from the beginning and start working on pieces that I've played 10 times, but start working on them as if they're the first time, and go back to the beginning and play them really slowly, and make sure that, again, I'm being honest about what I'm doing. And for me, I have to do that, because if I don't, I'll just always feel like I'm just sort of ignoring the growth process. So, I'll start working on, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony slowly, just to make sure I, refamiliarize myself with the key signature, make sure the bow strokes are there, make sure I'm, not playing messy.
And Ian Hallas, the newest member of the Lyric Opera of Chicago bass section, goes into great detail about how he uses slow practice through the audition prep process.
Here, take the first one in Mozart 40. I like to play that around half note 104-ish. I would be below 50 to start that excerpt for this particular example. So it's pretty unrecognizable. And you're just at that point, you're getting used to the mechanics of everything. Is it in tune? But more importantly, do you know what you're going to accomplish by the end? You want to always have a clear map to where you're going with the excerpts. So, and that, like I said before, that was something I think I was missing up until recently. So I want to hear the shape that I want to make even if it's at an unrecognizable tempo, because as you get it closer to tempo, it's actually going to be easier to make those shapes because they're more organic. The first day of my prep, I'm going to put the metronome on 60 and play each note of that list at 60. So just one note per second of the entire list.
The entire list, each note at 60. Wow. We'll hear more about Ian's routine on future episodes, but you can get an idea of how seriously many successful audition takers are about their slow practice. Another thing that successful audition takers do is record themselves. Ranaan Meyer from Time for Three talks about the massive gains in quality a former student experienced once he started taping himself.
You can record yourself and listen back. I think that's a huge thing. I just had a student recently the other day. A great student has really been coming on. His name's Brent Edmondson. Goes to Temple now, studies with Rob Kesselman. And used to work with me some. We used to work together. And he said that he just started recording himself a week ago. And before he said that, I was complimenting him profusely because I was so blown away with how far he came in 2 or 3 lessons. I was working with him at the summer camp. I teach with Hal Robinson. And I said, man, what have you been doing? This is incredible. And he said, well, I just started recording myself a week ago.
So recording can bring about significant gains. Ira Gold places a high priority on recording as well.
If I have the opportunity to set aside some time to record myself, I'll do that too. That way I can go back and listen to it and decide if what I'm hearing on the recording matches what I'm hearing when I'm actually playing. Sometimes those two things don't match up.
Think back to those simple concepts that Owen Lee and Michael Hovnanian mentioned. Are you playing in tune? Are you playing in time? Are you playing what's on the page? That's what a recording will reveal. Ian Hallas even records himself while under tempo.
I started recording while things were still under tempo. So I think about a week before I started my run through, I was recording, let's say, there's a Meredith Figueroa excerpt where the performance tempo is around 126 to 132 to the half bar. So I was around 104. And I was recording that just to make sure everything was lining up, that I wasn't rushing things, that the general shapes that I wanted to make were there, like certain tapers of notes and releases of notes. And, I have the notes. I made notes every single time. I would listen to it every single night and make notes on what I wanted to work on for the next day. And it was very helpful to see where things were going, so that way you don't have everything at tempo and just record it and then be surprised by the way some things sound. So you catch it at a certain level where you know how things are going to sound because they're slow enough. You're still in complete control because you're not necessarily familiar with the way that everything is going. And then you can catch it and just kind of ride it as things hit tempo, and then you start running through and you work on the consistency alone.
Okay, slow practice and recording. Two very important techniques that practically everyone uses. Yet, as Ed Barker mentioned, most people vastly underestimate the amount of time actually needed to achieve mastery. How you approach these moments in the practice room and the ways in which your mind is engaged are critical. Chicago Symphony principal bassist Alex Hanna shares his thoughts on practicing for auditions.
In the practice room, you should make every effort to perform all the time. The word practice kind of has a mindless connotation for a lot of people, which I think is really bad. This is actually a kind of a Bud Herseth quote, the never practice, always perform. Mm-hmm. My piano teacher used to tell me this too when I would sometimes come into a lesson and play something a little uninspired. She said that I had a musical button. And so she would just push my musical button. And, it's kind of that thing where you engage and you start to, maybe it's like a right brain, left brain thing, but you always want to have that button turned on. Whether you're playing scales and Samandel or you're playing the Koussevitzky Concerto, you want to be performing all the time. Breaking your practice up into smaller chunks is really effective. I love David Moore's idea of, I think he recommends 50-minute practice sessions. You can even set a timer I think that's a really great number.
We'll cover more details about how various players break up their practice time later in this series. There are a variety of methods that people find effective. Michigan State University bass professor Jack Budrow has a great technique for establishing tempo recall for excerpts.
I give metronome markings for every excerpt. And then after students learn the excerpts and if they're playing them, I ask them every day, when you get up, I want you to play the excerpt, and then I want you to turn on the metronome to see how close you could get to this tempo. And then practice for just a few minutes with the metronome on, and then practice that excerpt a few minutes with the metronome off. I think the recall is good because a lot of times people get into auditions and they get the adrenaline going and they try to play too fast. Occasionally they try to play too slow. So the recall of the actual tempo is pivotal so that you know before you start playing exactly how fast it's going to be.
Brandon Mclean found that his audition-taking skills got more solid as he started to practice in larger spaces.
Some of the more helpful things for me has been, it was relatively late in life, I feel like, that I really got to spend time, a significant amount of time by myself in a large space in like a concert hall practicing. I'd been a real practice room practicer for a long time. And my concept of sound was based on the fact that, you know, things were bouncing back to me from 3 feet away as opposed to 300 feet away or more in a concert hall. So a really helpful thing for me was getting into big halls and putting a microphone a long ways away from me and realizing what I actually sounded like to the people that were listening on the panel a long ways away from me. One of the more helpful things for me has been getting over the idea that I don't really know what I sound like just from listening through my own ears. I guess it's similar to the way that you hear your own voice. Whenever you hear your voice back on tape, it's like, this doesn't sound at all like me, but it's because you're listening to your own voice through all these bones and muscles and all these things that are changing the way you're hearing your own voice as opposed to the way other people are hearing. And it's the same way with bass playing. The angle that you're listening to yourself playing the bass, nobody else is hearing it at that angle. You know, you're above the thing, you're nowhere, the F-holes are close to you, but they're not pointed at you, and you're moving around a bunch, and you're doing all these things that are getting in the way of really hearing yourself. So I got really serious about recording myself, and I think that was when things started to turn a little bit for me, when I really got a sense of what I was doing that made a difference to the actual listener.
What are you doing that can actually be heard by the listener? That's a great way to approach recording. Speaking of what can actually be heard by the listener, Jack Budrow advocates going for different sounds for each composer.
I don't agree that sound should be one sound at all. I think that's the part of the style differences between composers. It's you have a Mozart sound, then you have a Beethoven sound, and then the Brahms sound is a little different from that. And they're all a little bit unique. Conductors love that. I know this sounds ridiculous, but occasionally I ask my students, I say, now play this Beethoven excerpt as if it were Mozart. How would it sound? And then I'll say, let me hear this Beethoven excerpt as if it were Brahms, how that would sound. And make them go from one style to another, playing the same music, just so they stay flexible and they understand that this is really what Mozart sounds like, even though Beethoven wrote it. I just think it helps them stay flexible.
Stylistic flexibility and having a different sound for different composers is valuable food for thought. Jack also talks about note lengths and how they should relate to each other.
Another thing I feel is important is the style of how short or long notes are has to be stylistically congruent through the chain. In other words, if you're playing 16ths, decca, 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 da, and then the H should be da, 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 and the quarters da, 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 and the halves da, da, like for Mozart. So I hear people play Mozart 40, for example, and they'll play la la da 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 dum, la da 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 da. I don't agree with that. I think it should be ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-dum. Like the quarters are half again longer than the eighths that you're playing. So it's stylistically congruent. I think that's a good idea.
Jack's comments go back to what Andy Raciti was talking about, making sure that the moves you're practicing at slow tempos are what would actually be done at the faster tempo, and that certainly includes note lengths. Now, Ed Barker encourages his students to use visualization when preparing for auditions.
There is a well-known phrase that I always like to use with my students is when you're building your performance, you're getting ready to perform and you're practicing as if you're performing. What you need to do is you need to imagine that you are, when you're in the practice room, you need to imagine or visualize what it's like to be, where it is. If it's in an audition, you got to imagine being behind the screen in a darkened hall, having walked down a long hallway first before you having to play this audition. You have to imagine that. You have to imagine this from your practice room setting. And then when you're in the audition or the recital or whatever, you have to imagine that you're back in your practice room.
We'll dig more into that concept of imagining you're back in your practice room when we get into people's specific audition routines next episode. It's an interesting conversation to have. How people preparing for auditions can focus on the audition excerpts so intently that it becomes a detriment. Indianapolis Symphony principal bassist Ju-Fang Liu talks about how she finds balance in her preparation.
First of all, I don't like to be overplayed, overpracticed, because things or the music or the excerpts tend to get stale if you overpractice them, in my opinion. So I think you want to have a pretty good balance. Keep things balanced. If you like running, you should keep on running. You should keep your, stress management is important because it's such a, for some people it's sort of like a life and death difference because you want to get a job, and every one of us has gone through that, I'm pretty sure. So, but if you, maybe there will be anxiety issues or something, and then you cannot perform your best.
Continuing to exercise is something that many successful auditioners talk about. And several also mention how beneficial they find working on music that's not on the audition list. Atlanta Symphony principal bassist Colin Corner shares his thoughts on keeping non-audition music in the mix.
I always try and keep, other solos and other kind of hard things under my fingers too, so I'm, just getting around the bass really nicely. And I guess I feel like I'm kind of more focused on that, just, really having really getting my musical level there and just my technical level there. And it doesn't have to be just working on the music for the audition and that month beforehand. You can be kind of working on solos and all sorts of different things, and it keeps you more kind of creatively in the ballpark, so you're not getting burnt out just working on those excerpts all the time. You're still sort of maturing as a musician and as a player in that month beforehand, without having to sort of get burnt out on just drilling the excerpts over and over again.
Michael Hovnanian has a great perspective on this as well.
I think, once you could sort of get your fingers around the excerpts and stuff, which a lot of players can do nowadays, I think rather than sort of beat your head over the excerpts too much, I'd say practice something else, or try and figure out what is it that I'm not doing well, what about my playing just generally needs to get better, not the fact that I can't play Mozart 35 as fast as I want to. So, I'm just going to play that over and over and over and over and over until I can get it faster. So, well, why can't I play it fast? Is it the shifting? Is it the bow? What is it? So try and break it down, then work on something, either scales or etudes or string crossing exercises, sort of try and boil it down to the essentials, I guess, I would say. And I think that tends to make the practicing more efficient, too, I think. so that when you come to the excerpt, you have a little more spontaneity, and then you bring sort of a fresher approach to it rather than just, it's like, oh my God, I played this. So, because you're going to have to play it a million times anyway. So almost try and stay away from it just a little bit would be my advice.
So slow practice, recording, playing in a large space, visualization, finding ways to alleviate stress, and continuing to practice other music. All of these have been mentioned time and time again by successful auditioners, and I hope that they help you in your preparation as well. Next episode, we'll follow along with several musicians through their entire audition preparation cycle, from the moment they got the list to the moment they walked on stage. And thank you so much for checking out this episode, and we'll see you next time here on Winning the Audition from Contrabass Conversations. Oh, I had such fun putting this series together, and I'm also, I don't know why I'm thinking about this now, but I'm just remembering the insane amount of work that it was just going through these episodes and figuring out what the heck I had in that back catalog. I spent 2 weeks, I think. It was at least 2 weeks. I would wake up at 6 a.m., I'd make a pot of strong coffee, and I would listen through to myself and John Grohl, but interviewing all of these people that we talked to for the first 7-8 years of the podcast, and noting the time at which different subjects came up. Watching paint dry, maybe that's a little more boring, but and man, is it painful to listen to yourself over and over and over again, particularly in the early episodes when I was really kind of finding my footing. But so glad to have this series together. And if you haven't checked this out before, I've put out several other kind of follow-up compilation episodes around jazz, another one on auditioning, actually, kind of a beyond winning the audition, fitness in the bass. I've got some more coming up in terms of recovering from injuries and that kind of thing. Love doing them. I do them as often as I can. They are a whole heap of work, but they're very fun to do. And if you go to contrabassconversations.com/highlights, that's the best URL I could think of, you will see all the ones I've done so far or will do in the future. And thank you to our other sponsors for the podcast, D'Addario Strings. We are talking about their Zyx strings right now. They are synthetic core strings. They produce an extremely warm, rich sound, and that is just such a fun string to play on. I've used them off and on. Right now I'm using Kaplan's on my bass. They're kind of flipping back and forth depending on the playing I'm doing. And I dig the Zyx strings. You can get the sound and feel of gut strings with more evenness, projection, stability than real gut. Check them out. contrabassconversations.com/strings will take you there. And thank you for sponsoring the podcast. And thank you also to the A440 Violin Shop. They are an institution in Chicago, in Roscoe Village, beautiful Roscoe Village, just west of Wrigley Field. And they are the place to go if you are in the Midwest for instruments, bows, repairs, restorations. They've got everything from student-level instruments up through fine professional instruments. You can visit a440violinshop.com. Okay, parts 3 and 4 coming up of the podcast. We're just going to let them play without 2017 Jason Chatter. So hope you enjoy this, and check out all other episodes like this at contrabassconversations.com/highlights. Welcome to Winning the Audition, a special series from Contrabass Conversations featuring advice from leaders in the field about preparing and executing auditions successfully. This series is drawn from interviews conducted with dozens of bassists from orchestras like the Philadelphia Orchestra, Boston Symphony, Cleveland Orchestra, National Symphony, Chicago Symphony, and Houston Symphony, plus some of the major pedagogues in the field. This series provides actionable advice that you can use to take your auditioning to the next level. And while we're speaking with bassists for these episodes, this advice can certainly be applied to other instruments and disciplines as well. This episode digs into successful routines that people have used to win auditions. And it's fascinating to look at both the diversity and the commonalities. I think you're really going to get a lot out of this episode. So excited to put this out. This is a meaty episode for sure. And I'm thrilled to have Discover Double Bass on board as our series sponsor. And I'd like to let you know a little bit about their Double Bass Scales Play-Along collection. And I've been using these tracks for the last couple of months in my own practice, and they're super helpful. It's an incredibly comprehensive resource. They've got 17 different types of scales in all 12 keys. And you get MP3s for these in slow versions, fast versions. That's great for practicing. Plus PDFs with fingerings, tips for practicing scales, and even key facts for each scale. And this is a great resource. I'm finding it tremendously helpful. It'd be great for teachers, students, anybody. Super cool. It's $49. It's worth every penny. Check this out and much more at discoverdoublebass.com. So today we start with Cleveland Orchestra principal bassist Max Dimoff, who gives us some general advice about preparing for auditions that I think is helpful. It's a good mindset. And he talks about his routine, which is all about dividing his practicing into 90-minute chunks.
In my preparation, I would wake up every morning at 7 o'clock and do my technical routine, get it out of the way first thing in the morning. I'd be done by 8:30. And then actually, when I was preparing for the Cleveland audition, I had a job with the Seattle Symphony, and I had a baby. And so I had to find a way to work that into my life. And so any student that tells me that they can't find time to practice, I just don't buy it, because I know you have classes, I know you have final exams and everything else, but that's just not that's not as busy as having a child and having a job too. So because I've been in both of those places. So I would go to my morning rehearsal that morning. You know, if you're a student, you go to your classes in the morning, and then I would practice from 2 to 3:30 in the afternoon, unless I had a rehearsal in the afternoon, and I would really break down my excerpts instead of just running through things, just sort of pounding them out. I hate the idea of pounding out excerpts. And I would really take them apart and work on them little bits at a time, and maybe spend 10, 15 minutes on the more difficult ones, maybe 5 minutes even on a small snippet of something. Say like I remember the Marriage of Figaro. It was on my audition for Cleveland. And so I'm not going to spend 45 minutes working on that. Just take it apart into bowing the rhythm patterns, and not even bothering to play it through necessarily. Mm-hmm. And then in the evening, I would practice from 7 to 8:30 doing the same thing, and focusing actually a little more on my solo at that time, just to sort of mix it up a little bit and keep my mind as fresh as I could. And so I've had 3 sessions of an hour and a half, unless I had a concert, that I couldn't do that. And 4.5 hours a day of really focused practice that's really enough time. And I find too that breaking it up that way, that I was always fresh physically and mentally for the next session. I couldn't wait to get to the next session, because I wouldn't ever wear myself down. So to this day, I never practice more than an hour and a half at a time.
Michael Hovnanian of the Chicago Symphony advises taping, playing for other people, and keeping up your musical imagination by practicing other music.
The thing that I didn't do enough of was play for other people, which I think is great, because I seem to be moving around a lot, or I wasn't studying with anybody. But I think that is a huge thing, is to make sure that you play for other people. That, and taping, I think are really important. I think, once you could sort of get your fingers around the excerpts and stuff, which a lot of players can do nowadays, I think rather than sort of beat your head over the excerpts too much, I'd say practice something else, or try and figure out what is it that I'm not doing well, what about my playing just generally needs to get better, not the fact that I can't play Mozart 35 as fast as I want to. So, I'm just going to play that over and over and over and over and over until I can get it faster. So, well, why can't I play it fast? Is it the shifting? Is it the bow? What is it? So try and break it down, then work on something, either scales or etudes or string crossing exercises, sort of try and boil it down to the essentials, I guess, I would say. And I think that tends to make the practicing more efficient too, I think, so that when you come to the excerpt, you have a little more spontaneity, and then you bring sort of a fresher approach to it rather than just, it's like, oh my God, I played this. So, because you're going to have to play it a million times anyway. So almost try and stay away from it just a little bit would be my advice.
Many successful auditioners talk about what Michael just described, the importance of kind of staying away from the excerpts and finding other ways to practice those techniques through scales or etudes or exercises that hit on what you really need to work on for the audition. It's something that you'll hear more about as this series progresses. Now, Michael's colleague, Alex Hanna, principal bass at the Chicago Symphony, covers in great detail his experience preparing for his Chicago Symphony audition.
So I got the announcement in August of that year, and that was a pretty big moment for me, opening up the union paper, and it was like, well, there it is.
Last time that job was posted was who was president?
Yeah, seriously. Well,
Eisenhower, maybe.
That job had probably never even been posted.
Yeah, that's true.
That was back in the days when it was kind of a recommendation of a conductor. So I was thrilled. I remember just holding that paper. I saw it, I read it a few times, and then I kind of closed it and looked up, and I just started pacing around the house. It's like, okay, I've been waiting for this my whole life. What am I going to do? It was a very thrilling moment for me. And so, I remember my bass was in the shop at that moment, and so I couldn't practice. And so I finally got my bass back, and it was all cleaned up. I got the fingerboard all set up, and I was like a madman. I really started practicing. It was practicing at a whole nother level than I had ever done before. So we were off for the summer at that point. Most orchestras don't play in August or early September. I wasn't going on vacation or anything, so I would drive downtown to the hall, and nobody was there because we were on vacation, and I was practicing 5 or 6 hours a day. I would get up really early and get down there probably around 9:30, and I'd practice until 4 or 5. I was drinking lots of coffee, and it was fun. It was just so fun to be down there at the hall. Nobody was there, and I still had a lot of time before the prelims too. The prelims were in, I think, late November, so that's a lot of time. And I also didn't have the list yet, but I knew, I just want to start getting better. And so I would practice box suites and standard excerpts, concerti, all this stuff. And I was just really pushing. And I was also really honest about what my weaknesses were. I wasn't playing, I'm really good at Brahms' 2-letter E. That's kind of one of my excerpts that's just always in the pocket. I wasn't practicing that. I was practicing Mendelssohn 4, which is extremely challenging to me. And I was really pushing, and sometimes I would spend a whole day on one excerpt, really picking it apart. As you get closer to the audition, you want to be going through the rep pretty consistently, all of it on a consistent basis. But starting so early, I had a great opportunity to really bring my playing to a higher level. So I did that practicing schedule for several months. And then we went back to work, and I was playing with the DSO, that was the year we were on strike. So that vacation kind of just
extended.
Yeah. And so I just had all this time to practice, and I used every bit of it. My wife had a full-time job at the time, and so it was just me and the dog. And sometimes I would even take the dog over to a friend's house just not to be distracted. Mm-hmm. So I took it really seriously. Then approaching the audition, I played for a lot of people in the Detroit Symphony, a lot of former teachers, and I performed the list for a lot of people.
Like Alex shared, starting early is such a critical factor in audition success, and so many successful auditioners have this same experience. And the excitement in Alex's voice describing preparing for the audition, it just sounds like so much fun. And what a healthy way to approach an audition. Alex talks about how he divides the list up for practicing purposes and also the importance of taking time off during this preparation process.
I always split the list into 4 groups. So, on one day, I'll do half the list in the morning, then the other half in the afternoon or evening. And then of that B list, so I got like A and B. Then on the second day, I do the B list, half in the morning, half in the afternoon.
Stylistic logic, or you just break them down alphabetically, or do you?
Yeah, stylistically, I like to split them up. So if there's, let's say that Mozart 39, Mozart 40, and, Heldenleben and Don Juan are all on the list. I'll do one Mozart and one Strauss on one day, and then one Mozart and one, Strauss on the other day. And I also found it to be really helpful to take one complete day off every 7 days. So one day off a week where I don't play the bass at all. And then I like to never go more than 3 days straight without doing a half day. So a half day being, I'll just practice a couple hours in the morning and then I'll be done. I'll do something fun the rest of the day. And that half day turned out to be kind of a really nice crutch or kind of relief, because sometimes, I would even do one day after a day off and think to myself, I am really burnt out. There's no inspiration coming out of me right now. Just going to do a half day. So that way you can still get something done and not feel really guilty or beat yourself up about it. And then you go back after that half day thinking, okay, I'm fresh now. I can put 3 big days on here. Usually by the 3rd day, I was getting pretty crazy, and kind of frustrated with what I was doing. But that was a great schedule.
It's interesting to look at the commonalities between Max, Michael, and Alex, and finding ways to avoid burnout and keep the level of practice at a point where it's an enjoyable process seem to come up time and time again. Let's take 2 players that have recently won auditions: Houston Symphony principal bassist Robin Kesselman and Lyric Opera of Chicago bassist Ian Hallas. And let's take a large-scale look at how they prepare for auditions. We'll start with Ian talking about how he views the entire process zoomed out.
I'm most comfortable starting a list about, I'd say, 4 to 6 weeks outside of the audition. Otherwise, if there's any more time, my head just kind of explodes. There's just too many things to think about for too long. So I get it inside my head.
And here's Robin, very similar, but a few differences.
I like to have 7 or 8 weeks, and the way I structure it in my mind is more kind of by percentage of time that has elapsed, as opposed to maybe a week thing. But I want to take the first 50% of the interval and really hibernate and start things, even if I've worked on, like, if I need to work on Beethoven 5, 3rd movement. If I had to start working on it tomorrow, day 1 would be considerably under 50% tempo, like considerably under half tempo, and then working it up over, if I have 4 weeks, then really being militant about proportionally working it up.
And a lot of people talked about this slow practice, this long-term slow practice. Andy Raciti was talking about half-tempo, quarter-tempo in episode 2 of this series, and Ian digs into that as well.
Most of the time, it's spent under tempo. So given the amount of time that I've given myself, I'll take an excerpt as far back in time as I can. I've gone as far as 40% of tempo. So, for example, here, take the first movement, Mozart 40. I like to play that around half note 104-ish. I would be below 50 to start that excerpt for this particular example. So it's pretty unrecognizable. And you're just, at that point, you're getting used to the mechanics of everything. Is it in tune? But more importantly, do you know what you're going to accomplish by the end? You want to always have a clear map to where you're going with the excerpts.
Both of these guys have this slow, methodical plan in mind. They've sketched it all out. Here's Robin on the same topic.
It's not like I work it up really slow and then I kind of bang through it a little while and then I kind of come back to it being slow. I mean, if I have to move something 40 clicks divided over every other day for 4 weeks, and I don't want to do that math on the air. But whatever it is, I don't know. I think that there's a different type of consistency, and there's just a different product that comes from that kind of approach. Really not letting myself just then kind of have some fun time at the end of a practice session, just barrel through things, really try not to instill all the things that brings with it.
So Alex Hanna talked about dividing the list, and that's something you hear time and time again from these successful auditioners, and Robin talks a bit about that too. He goes into quite a bit of detail.
If I have a list, I sort of divide it down the middle, but kind of do it fantasy draft style. So if I have 2 Beethoven symphonies, then I put one on each day, or depending on what they are, and that kind of thing. There's 2 Mozart symphonies if they're complete symphonies. Try and make the lists kind of parallel each other, so it's not like all have complementary challenges where they're kind of both yin instead of one being a yin and a yang. Like,
sure,
not one isn't all strokey, one isn't all lyrical. That's overly simplifying. But kind of try to think seriously about the way I divide it up. Same with orchestra solos, like do half them on one, half the other way, and then just do it every other day.
And in addition to practicing the list slowly and building it up over time, Ian talks about tuning the list, practicing the entire list at 60, basically throughout the entire process.
Starting the first day of my prep, I'm going to put the metronome on 60 and play each note of that list at 60. So just 1 note per second of the entire list. I might make amendments to that if there's a bunch of complete works.
Sure.
But for the lyric list since October, almost every single day I've been playing each note of that entire list at, let's say each note is a quarter note 60 for almost 3 months. And that just helps you solidify the pitch, because if you can play something in tune slowly, it's going to be better in tune fast. The opposite is not true at all. The tuning is still happening every single day. Even the morning of the lyric finals, I tune the whole list start to finish. Yeah, so that's what my preparation looks like.
Both Ian and Robin talk about how they take the show on the road, how they start to play for people, how they record, and how that takes place kind of in the second half of the prep process. Here's Robin talking through the process for him.
I would say the first 50% of the time, so if it's 8 weeks, if the first 4 weeks, I really don't play for people. I mean, I really don't. Nothing's put together. It's all really very cut up. So if that's 4 weeks, then we got 4 to go. Then the next 2 or the next 1 is really kind of buffering the edges, making sure they're being put back together to being real pieces of music, and kind of smooth out the wax and give it a shine. So it's back to being complete pieces, and you're playing with recordings, getting the flow right, and all this while, both in the first half too, recording not just daily but kind of constantly. You record a lot. I mean, it's so easy. It's we can just record on our phones. So there's I'm not too concerned with sound quality until maybe later. But at first, I mean, it's just kind of feedback, and it's amazing what we can't perceive while we're playing. It's incredible. And then I would say when I'm kind of putting it together, and then maybe spend a week feeling more comfortable about that, and then I just take the show on the road, play for everybody and anybody that'll listen start setting up mocks or lessons with other instruments. And I felt like once I got to Philadelphia, I really kind of stopped playing for bass players that weren't my teachers or colleagues, doing mock auditions. But I remember having a great lesson with the timpanist of Philly Orchestra, bassoon player, just people who I just looked up to and were inspired by, and just got so much more out of that aspect of it. Because the truth of the matter is, bass players don't hire us. Bass players. I don't really know. I can't speak for every orchestra's committee complement, but it's going to be under 50%. And so, I remember the timpanist. He said something amazing. I remember I was playing some part of Mahler 5, and he said, "Robin, that sounds great. I can tell you're playing this passage really well, but I have no idea what the pitches are." And that was really eye-opening because it was like, if your ear's not totally living in this universe, the sound world that we live in, then you might as well just muffle the strings with your left forearm and bang away. It would sound the same to a lot of these people. So just having a newfound commitment to making sure there's pitch and tone throughout all aspects of all types of past work,
Ian talks about playing for people as well.
I'll also play for as many people as possible. I've always been fortunate to have very supportive studio members who are happy to go out of their way to listen to you. And I have great teachers who, have given me more time than I might deserve. Even I'll go downtown in LA and play for some of the Philharmonic members, just anybody who I can get a hand on. It's important to also play for non-bass players because they hear things differently. I have a really good friend who I did my undergrad with who just began her master's at USC in vocal performance, and I played for her, and she was just extremely helpful in getting some of the characters solid because she knew the operas far better than I did. Obviously, I knew what was going on in the opera when I was playing the excerpts, because context is everything, but her sort of total immersion in that world for as long as she'd been in it was really helpful. So I'd recommend playing for anybody you can get to come in the room with you.
Okay, we're now getting down to the last week or maybe 2 weeks of preparation. And both of these guys have a lot of similarities, but a few differences. Here's what Robin does that last bit of time.
The last week, I kind of go back to hibernating and really kind of stop playing for people. I don't taper off like hours-wise. I think hours-wise, study through, it's all pretty much the same. It's just that they're used differently. So then the last week, kind of go back to hibernating and really start running like kind of rounds, like kind of start running like 4 or 5 excerpts in a row or 3 in a row. And I kind of just know what really I have to, and running for myself in a recorder and maybe taking 3 excerpts, running them and listening and then doing it again and doing that for a while and then moving on, maybe like an hour and a half or something and then moving on. And just really kind of getting back to like very private, building myself up. I don't really need to have things go wrong in front of people the last like 3 days before I'm going to leave. Right. It just isn't really like helpful for me.
Here's Ian 10 days out before the audition.
10 days before the audition is when I start to run things. And like I said, with the lyric audition, I'm going to start recording a few days before that just to catch things as they're close enough to tempo where they start to make sense. You can start to put the pieces together about what's actually happening. But I decided on 10 days of run-throughs because Dave, my master's teacher, he gave us a book about a year ago. He gave us a little kind of winter break book project. So he bought us all this book called Toughness Training for Sports, and it's by James Lohr. I think that's how to pronounce his last name. It's spelled Loehr, and it's a book on mental toughness training. So just increasing your own resilience and how you deal with stress. It's a really interesting book, but something that really struck me as important was the notion that he said a peak performance is only going to last for 1 to 2 weeks. And he's talking about athletes. I think in his context, he was talking about sprinters. So sprinters are going to work on their mechanics for a bunch of time, and when they're building up to a race, they'll really start to hit their stride about 1 to 2 weeks before. So using that in my own audition context, I started after I read the book, I started to use about 2 weeks. And things were still consistent at the end of those 2 weeks, but towards the end, they felt really good. Whereas when I would show up with 2 weeks of run-throughs, it was a little fatigued. I don't want to say I got complacent with the way things were, but I didn't really feel like I was in the pocket when I would play those things. with 2 weeks of run through. So I decided 10 days, and that's what I did for both Atlanta and Lyric, and the results kept getting better. Mm-hmm. So 10 days out, I do two things. The first is that every morning, I'm a morning guy, so I'll get as much work as I can done early in the day. I'll unpack the bass, tune, put a little bit of rosin on, and just run excerpts. So if it's an orchestral audition, I'll run standard excerpts that I assume are most likely to be asked on a prelim round. So, for example, it might be first and last movement in Mozart 35. It's going to be Heldenleben 9, some Brahms 2 things, just like the things you've practiced forever, Beethoven 5, it's a trio. And it's so hard on the first day because it feels awful. You know, you might not have even stretched, you might not have even gone anywhere. If you're practicing in your house, you might have just gotten out of bed and done it. But the goal is to improve your worst playing. Mm-hmm. Because if you can do that, when you walk on stage and have to do it the first time, you're going to know that you've done this work if you can pick up the bass without having warmed up at all and play your excerpts down at a high level. So that's the first thing I'll do. And I do record that to just get all of the bugs, the hiccups, burps, and farts all out of there.
The concept of improving your worst playing is also referred to sometimes as adversity training. It's a concept that Don Green talks about a lot in his books. We link to those in the first part of this series, and we'll link to the book that Ian is describing for this episode as well. And by the way, it sounds like we're going to have Don Green as a podcast guest, so I'm really looking forward to that. Lyric Opera of Chicago bassist Greg Sarchet explores adversity training too. Here's a clip of both Peter Tambroni talking about what Greg does and Greg himself.
Take everything to the next level. Okay, you practiced your shift, but can you nail it every time without even thinking about it?
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
Like what Greg was telling me when he was preparing for the Lyric Opera, his audition year back in the 80s or whatever. And Greg's he's such a great player and great musician. But he told me he would practice, and this is almost like a Jedi. He would use earplugs sometime. He would use a blindfold sometime and practice for the audition like that. Because now you're taking variables out of the equation, you know, and I love that, you know. Mm-hmm. People say, well, how can I overcome this? I'm like, don't overcome it, take it out of the equation, man, you know. Well, I'm nervous. Well, why are you nervous? You know, odds are nerves often come from you just didn't practice it that 10% more, right? Where it's so comfy, right? A lot of times. So there's a lot of other things for nerves. But you know, man, if you could play your piece with earplugs in, and then you get to the audition, and you're like, oh man, I'm good. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You've just taken it to that next level. So instead of the audition being kind of like, okay, I've never been up to 60 miles per hour, but here I am. I've got the nerves. I got this. Now he's like, man, I've driven 70. Man, the audition's only 60 miles an hour. This is a piece of cake. Yeah.
That was Pete, and here's Greg, and this was recorded, my only podcast ever recorded in a Bosnian pizza joint.
You know, I know there's some of the exercises that I've talked to you about in the past, some sensory deprivation exercises and stuff like that, which I think are pretty interesting, and I've actually never heard, so I wonder if you want to talk about that a little bit with the blindfolds.
Well, yeah, certainly using the blindfold, and that was inspired from Bobby Shu, jazz trumpet player in L.A. Earplugs, you know, just the cheap foam earplugs cut out the high range and actually amplify mid and low frequency, and playing with one ear and then the other. Earplugs plus a blindfold, and this was actually had its roots while preparing for that Lyric audition in 1985 when I knew there was going to be a screen. So I would practice with a towel over my head to feel deprived and cut off and oppressed. And then also having people throw things at you while you play, like a little piece of paper, wadded up paper.
And you know, this can sound goofy or excessive if you haven't experienced any sort of adversity training before, but it's something that people find quite valuable. It's something that Don Green's worked with people on for years, and I'd recommend checking out Performance Success, Audition Success, Fight the Fear and Win, any of his books for reading more about this. All right, back to Ian with a few thoughts on the mental preparation that goes into an audition.
When the physical run-throughs start, I'll begin doing mental run-throughs where either I'll have the music with me or I'll just close my eyes and listen to a recording of the excerpt and go through it in my head as it's happening, so I can feel both in my right and my left hand that I'm playing with the orchestra. And the interesting thing is that if there's any holes in your mental run-throughs, you'll kind of realize that maybe it wasn't so solid in your physical run-throughs, that maybe that's a spot that's a candidate for not necessarily memory slip, but just a loss of focus. Mm-hmm. So highlighting those, seeing where they come out, and consequently fixing those. And it's important because as you play for people, no matter how nervous you are the first time, it's more than like it's going to be less nervous the second time and the third time too. Leading up to an audition, you're playing for people and you're just not even nervous anymore. The more people that are in the room, it just doesn't really matter. You're just getting consistent. But it's important to prepare yourself for the audition when something strange might happen. Say somebody's trying to get under your skin. Fortunately, that's never happened to me, but there might be somebody in the room who's looking to get under your skin, or you might not have as much warm-up time as you thought you would, or you might have too much warm-up time and you're just not sure what's going on and you're going crazy, you're starting to overthink things. So you really need to be able to fall back on your mental focus when you're going in the audition, because the first time is the one that counts. You're more than likely you're not going to get a do-over. So you want to be able to focus on what you're trying to accomplish.
There's a real debate about whether it's better to come out to the audition one day before or 2 days before to acclimate yourself. There are pros and cons to both approaches. Brandon Mclean of the Pittsburgh Symphony talks about just coming out one day before.
I usually fly in the day before. I've done the routine where I fly in a couple of days before, but I always managed to psych myself out when I did that. It's easier for me not to think too much about the audition. So if I fly out the night before, that's usually when I feel best, and then head into the audition the next day.
So this is true for many people, what Brandon's describing, but others, including Ian, find that it's helpful to get out a couple days early and get settled in. Here are Ian's thoughts.
I started, and I got this from Kevin Brown, who's the principal of the Detroit Symphony. He liked to fly out 2 days before his audition, and he would take his flying day, his travel day, completely off. So 2 days before the audition, he's not playing at all, and then have the following day, which is the day before the audition, to run things, kind of get comfortable with where he was at, retune things again, and just get comfortable with where you are so that you're not flying in the day before and your flight gets delayed and you don't get in until midnight and you have to play at 9 a.m. or something crazy like that, which definitely happens. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was really helpful. And actually, when I was looking at the auditions I've taken, the 4 auditions that I got out of prelims for, I'd had a buffer day, even before I realized that I needed to do that, which I thought was really interesting. So the 4 auditions where I didn't arrive 2 days in advance, I did in advance.
And Robin has an interesting mindset about preparing all the way until he's on stage, and there's never a moment when he couldn't make things better.
The biggest thing about the last week was I never decided that there was a day when I could not make things better. Like, I think that seems like in the tapering, I hear people talk about just kind of needing to chill out and stuff, and that works, and that, like, people really are into that. But I just felt like even the day before I leave, if I can shore up a pulse somewhere or kind of get a longer line somewhere, I mean, I'm recording until maybe the night before, or even in the hotel room. I just need to kind of keep having the end date be on stage in the round, and not the end date be 4 days preceding or something like that.
This gives you a window into some preparation routines that people have found successful. And we're going to close out today's episode with a series of excerpts. Some of them you've actually heard before, but several of them you haven't. You'll be hearing from Alex, you'll be hearing from Max, Ian, and then also Leon Bosch and Gaelen McCormick. And I think one of the valuable things about synthesizing all this together like this is the chance to just get to hear people's perspectives back to back. And I'd love to have you listen for the grit and the tenacity and the mindset in these people's words. You can just feel that dedication and that drive in the way that they're describing their preparation process. And the final episode in this series is all about that special something that incredibly hard to quantify, something that differentiates the good from the great, that magical quality. We're going to try to, as best we can, quantify and define and give some tips and techniques for developing that extra something special. So that'll be the last episode of this series. Enjoy these clips from some of these wonderful talents that we've had on the podcast.
Every morning by about 7:15, I walked through the front doors of the University of Cape Town, the South African College of Music, and I didn't leave till after 10 o'clock at night, 7 days a week for 4 years. And that made the difference.
I'm going to give myself a year. I think I can do these gigs for a year and barely scrape by, and I'm not going to do any day jobs anymore. And I just committed myself to practicing every morning from the minute I got up.
I would wake up every morning at 7 o'clock and do my technical routine, get it out of the way first thing in the morning. I'd be done by 8:30.
I would drive downtown to the hall, and nobody was there because we were on vacation, and I was practicing 5 or 6 hours a day.
I had this whole schedule that went basically from 9 to 2, where I would practice, stop and make tea, practice, stop and take a shower, practice.
I would get up really early and, get down there probably around 9:30, and I'd practice until 4 or 5.
And I would really break it down and break down my excerpts instead of just running through things, just sort of pounding them out. I hate the idea of pounding out excerpts.
And my playing got so much better, not surprisingly. I could be up by 9 easily, considering no matter where I had driven back from. But yeah, I would start, 9 o'clock was scales, then it was tea time, and then 10 o'clock was usually etudes. Take another little break, then I would usually start and I would have the rep laid out for whatever audition I was taking, and from that point on, that's what I would work on.
Also really honest about what my weaknesses were. I wasn't playing, I'm really good at Brahms' 2-letter E. That's kind of one of my excerpts that's just always in the pocket. I wasn't practicing that. I was practicing Mendelssohn 4, which is extremely challenging to me. Pushing, and sometimes I would spend a whole day on one excerpt, really picking it apart.
I had a particular habit. I had a way in which I worked. I worked intensely for 20 minutes, and then I'd leave the room, go away and sit down, think about it, and come back to 20 minutes more. I didn't work absolutely non-stop. I had concentrated periods, but they lasted all day.
there was at least 3 Saturdays that I spent a good 6 hours just playing one note over and over and over, bouncing my bow, trying to figure out how it works. And it was almost like meditation. You have this kind of dorky idea of a bunch of monks sitting around going, Om. That's basically what I was doing with a bass, except instead of that, I was going, for hours on end.
I'm going to put the metronome on 60 and play each note of that list at 60. So just 1 note per second of the entire list.
I remember just holding that paper. I saw it, I read it a few times, and then I kind of closed it and looked up, and I just started pacing around the house. It's like, okay, I've been waiting for this my whole life.
Welcome to Winning the Audition, a special series from Contrabass Conversations featuring advice from leaders in the field about preparing and executing auditions successfully. This series is drawn from interviews conducted with dozens of bassists from orchestras like the Philadelphia Orchestra, Boston Symphony, Cleveland Orchestra, National Symphony, Chicago Symphony, and Houston Symphony, plus some of the major pedagogues in the field. This series provides actionable advice that you can use to take your auditioning to the next level. And while we're speaking with bassists for these episodes, this advice can certainly be applied to other instruments and disciplines as well. This 4th and final episode is titled Sealing the Deal and dives into what distinguishes players that win auditions. And I'm hoping that this episode is something that you can play over and over to yourself the final weeks before an audition. It's all about achieving the type of mindset that leads to successful auditions. And before we dig in, I'd like to thank our series sponsor, Discover Double Bass. They've got several in-depth courses available, including the Double Bass Scales Play-Along Collection that I spoke about in the last episode, the Bowing Technique course, Beginner's course, Creating Walking Bass Lines course, and each of these courses include hours of HD videos, PDFs of exercises, and access to a members-only study group. And there's a lot of free content on the site as well, including previews of each of these courses. So check them out on their website, discoverdoublebass.com. And a big thank you to Discover Double Bass founder Jeff Chalmers for sponsoring this series. Okay, one of the key commonalities mentioned by those we've been following along with in this series is taking the show on the road. In other words, playing the list for people, doing it over and over again for different groups of people. If you're in school, that can start with studio class. Michigan State University bass professor Jack Budrow does a great job describing the value of playing for people.
In my class at Michigan State, one of the most beneficial things we do, other than lessons themselves, is studio class. Because we always we go over orchestral repertoire and solo repertoire, but anybody who's going to take an audition, they'll come in and play that audition maybe 2, maybe 3 times, or at least twice before the audition, so that they've already played the audition and they've done it in front of people, and then we could critique those people right in front of them. I mean, it's positive and upbeat, but still a critique. And so that helps them feel like the first time that they're going to play these excerpts isn't actually the audition itself. And sometimes we turn them around so they can't see anybody, even though they're playing for people. So I think playing, performing the list and the audition goes a long way to a successful audition when you're actually there.
Rochester Philharmonic bassist Gaelen McCormick talks about how playing in Jeff Turner's studio class helped her.
Our studio class every Monday night was 2 or 2.5 hours long, and it was really good. It was really intense, as we did orchestra prep. But he would combine the two schools, the Duquesne studio and the Carnegie Mellon studio, and he occasionally had 1 or 2 really talented high school students that would join us. So we'd be in this big circle of like 16 or 17 of us, and we'd go around and play the excerpts, and that was so powerful for me because I would get so nervous, and he knew this about me, and I don't know, I still think he did this to me on purpose, where it was like, he'd call the next excerpt, it was Gaelen. Like, shit, like there was no time to prepare, there was no time to think, and I appreciated it. I hated every Monday night because of it, because I'm like, I'm going to want to throw up by the time we get to 9 o'clock tonight, but I think it made me much, much better at taking auditions.
And the value of playing for people in this kind of setting doesn't end once you land your first job. Berlin Philharmonic principal bassist Matthew McDonald describes how key playing for people was in his preparation for his current job.
I think the audition was in April 2008, and I started practicing for it in September 2007. Yeah, I started practicing quite a lot then, and then basically got it to a point about a month or two before where I was running it every day or two to people. I even played it to a bunch of 4-year-olds once. Oh, really? I would just use it. Yeah, anybody was an audience. Yeah, but I'd have lots of friends come out and listen, or I'd go to them. I did, it's a big run-through. Run-through is just for a couple of friends. I don't know how many I did, dozens. So that by the time of the audition, I felt like I'd been through as many possible kind of nerve-creating scenarios as possible. Yeah, I felt very free on the day. A lot of students make the mistake, they'll run it through for their tape recorder or something, but it's very different than playing it to your peers.
So playing for people, and not just bassists, but anyone, even 4-year-olds like Matthew did, is huge. And over, the people that I've interviewed have talked about that extra something special that differentiates good players from players that make audition committees really sit up and pay attention. We kicked off the first episode of this series with Chicago Symphony bassist Rob Kassinger describing how people fall typically into 3 categories.
If I'm going to sit down and listen to 100 people, you can break that number of people into 3 different groups, and the biggest group is in the middle, and there's probably 80 people at that audition who play really, really well. Not perfect, not, like the greatest player in the world, but play all the stuff in a manner that's, accurate to what's on the page. There's some musicality there, and that's like the big middle part. Then you've got maybe 10 people roughly at the low end of the spectrum who just unfortunately just shouldn't have, bothered to show up. And then you've got, at the upper end, you've got maybe 5 to 10 people, sometimes less, who really have something special. They've got the just ironclad rhythmic control. Their intonation is, it may not be flawless, but it's so close to being flawless that, you would just love to be sitting with this person, So, and that's really what it boils down to, rhythm, intonation, and this other category called musicality.
So now, let's dig into that category called musicality. Pittsburgh Symphony principal bassist Jeff Turner shares his perspective on musicality and how people can lose sight of this when preparing for auditions.
Right now, I think a lot of the people who come to me for coachings, who are hard hitting the audition circuit very hard and doing their best to play the orchestral repertoire well, have gotten so focused on those, just, 24 excerpts that they play over and over again, the same exact way, hoping for rhythm and articulation and pitch, which is great. I'm not saying any of that's not absolutely necessary, but I think often people in that mindset, and I found myself there as well, start to lose sense of the music part of it. And over again, I see people succeed at auditions who have just played 2 or 3 recitals that year, who are still in love with playing music and enjoying the bass. And I think we've got to find balance when we're in a situation like that about playing with beautiful sound and making phrases and enjoying the music and playing music for other people, not just turning it into this technical Olympic type event where it's just play the pitches and play the rhythms and bark them out in perfect time. I hear a lot of that, and that's not the people who I see being successful at auditions. My experience over, I guess, the past, it's been 20 years now that I've been listening to auditions. As a matter of fact, I had the great fortune of getting to be chair of the audition committee for the Pittsburgh Symphony for several years, which meant I got to hear every single audition on every instrument. And that was a fabulous education. At any audition, there are going to be people who simply aren't ready for that job. Some of it might be for technical reasons, some of it might be for a lack of imagination about any kind of sound quality. Let's say there are, I don't know, whatever percentage of people who are going to show up who just really won't be ready for the job. And I think there also are going to be lots of star players out there. At any given audition, there might just be 3 or 4 of them, but there's always going to be that supply of people who just, whether they're naturals on the instrument or have worked really hard, get out there and give a great presentation. I would say that the people in the level of the folks in the middle has risen remarkably just in the past 20 years. The average level of technical competence is better by far. I think not just at bass auditions, but pretty much across the board. The musicians that I know on committees, what really happens is they fall in love with the musicianship of a particular candidate or a few candidates. And then they go through their checklist of, now let's see, could I sit beside this person because was his pitch okay? Was the rhythm in this particular passage all right? Is this a sound that would work well in the setting of the orchestra? But remember, I said at the beginning that I thought they fell in love with that playing first. And that's what it's hard to talk about why they do that, I guess, but it's a musical thing. The things that audition committees and music directors fall in love with are musical values, not really technical values. Those technical values you got to have, but it's just not enough anymore.
Taking the focus off of those 24 excerpts and focusing on instead being a musical artist is something we've heard several people talk about in this series. Cincinnati Symphony principal bassist Owen Lee describes what he listens to from the committee perspective and the qualities beyond those rhythm and pitch fundamentals that he's looking for from candidates in the finals.
Once you get to the finals, you can do those fundamental things and then just add that extra sort of artistry. That's what we're looking for, a person who can play a beautiful phrase, a person who can sustain a musical line. We hear a lot of skilled players who make it to the finals, but then their playing sounds like if they were speaking like this. You know what I mean? It's sort of like word for word to word, like note to note. It's very notey playing instead of stringing words together to make sentences and paragraphs and phrases. So once you have the fundamentals, make sure that your playing communicates. It's like your speech. It doesn't sound word to word. There's a sense of line and narrative that eliminates so many people from auditions. Just the inability to sustain a phrase and to string notes together, into a musical line. And it doesn't matter if you're a timpanist or an oboist or a bass player. I mean, I've heard it all in auditions. Serving on audition committees. We look for that artistry. And then beyond that, once you have that skill, then it's a matter of imagination. Okay, what is this story trying to tell? I remember going to a master class with William Prussell, the concertmaster of Cleveland, going to one of his master classes once when I was in New World. And at the time, he was still playing in the Cleveland Quartet, and a violinist had played Don Juan for him, and this violinist played really, really well. It was beautifully in tune, beautiful sound. Everything was there. Technique was there, everything. And Bill Prussell goes, well, that was great, but so tell me a little bit about this guy Don Juan. That was the first thing he said. And so he and the students started painting a portrait of Don Juan. He's handsome, he's dashing, he's charming, and he's the son of a bitch. So these things like musical imagination. Once you have the fundamentals down, when you have the musical fundamentals down, then you use imagination. Try to paint a picture. If you're playing Beethoven Night, you want to sound angry. If you're playing, the Hoffner Symphony, usually when you hear the Hoffner Symphony, it sounds like what it is, which is a complete pain in the neck. But we forget that Mozart's the spirit that Mozart is conveying there is a spirit of joy. Or the Von Hall Concerto, usually when I hear people play the Von Hall Concerto, it sounds like what it actually is, which is it's not easy. There's a lot of labor involved. But this is like the Hoffner Symphony. This is a piece that's full of joy and elegance. It should be like a glass of champagne. It should be light and wonderful and sparkling and just put a smile on your face. And that's one thing I think people tend to forget, especially in auditions, because I think a lot of people get into the wrong mindset that it just has to be, people are just looking for a machine, just perfection, just like a robot, And yeah, the roboticism, that might get you out of the prelims, but it won't win you the job because if you're playing like a robot, you're going to be there in the finals with about 10 to 20 other people who can nail the notes just as well as you are. But the audition committee is going to pick the person, the guy or the gal who is playing with that artistry.
Making artistry and imagination the goal, rather than 100% perfection, is something that Lyric Opera of Chicago bassist Ian Hallas talks about as well.
Something that I realized after I call it my death semester, where I took 3 in a row and didn't get anywhere. I spent too long just trying to play perfectly. And by perfectly, I mean in tune and in time. In time was another struggle, but I dealt with that in time. But I realized that you can't make a living just assuming you're going to check off all the boxes when you take an audition and play an excerpt. If you have the dynamics down, if you have the tempo down, if you're in tune, it's not enough. There's a fifth element involved that I wasn't always bringing to the table. And that goes so far in auditions. People want to be inspired when they're hearing you play because they have, who knows, they can have upwards of 100 people playing in a prelim round. You have to distinguish yourself. And I think looking back on it, I spent a lot of time just thinking that being perfect was enough. It just wasn't at all. So I spent the summer just constantly trying to seek out more ways to bring out character and to just increase my dynamic palette to aid. A technique is a means to accomplish what you want to with a phrase or with any sort of a musical gesture.
Philadelphia Orchestra assistant principal bassist Joe Conyers describes his performance goals similarly.
But I think one of the things that Hal saw attractive in my playing was this kind of go-get-'em attitude and no holds barred when it came to expressiveness and trying to get a musical point across. And later he's told me that that's actually probably one of the hardest things to teach a student. And whereas the technique with practice and repetition, one can learn the technique eventually, but the musical aspect is actually some of the hardest things.
Joe also describes the idea of being yourself and how really embracing this philosophy helped him in auditioning.
I can think of 2 things right away. Mm-hmm. And they both stem off of this idea of be yourself. That concept. One is, I had a friend, a very successful vocalist, in one of my first years. There was one audition I took specifically where I thought it was all over. And she recommended, well, what do you do before the audition? I was lifting weights by that time, but what would happen is before the audition, I would stop lifting weights. I might change my diet. I might sleep more. Because I'm getting, of course, especially the day before, I'm getting ready for the audition. She told me, why do you do that? Because you should probably be as much like your normal self as humanly possible on the day of the audition versus being someone you aren't normal. So, gosh, even for Philadelphia, I was at the gym the week of the audition, all the way up. I play around and then go to the gym that night, and I didn't do crazy things with my hours. Some people stop drinking coffee. I don't drink coffee or anything like that. But I just try to keep my life normal so that the audition was part of my normal day and not like something special. Because once it becomes something special, then everything starts to change, and nothing should change. You should just play your instrument. That's one. The other aspect of this being yourself is, at some point, and this comes with maturity. I know it comes with maturity because I can look back and actually say this. At some point, you just have to say, I don't care what the people behind that screen think. I don't care at all. This is who I am as an artist, one. Two, I can't change anything about my playing on the day of that job. I can't be better than I already am. So instead of trying to be something, again, that I'm not, enjoy who I am and be the best musician in that moment and articulate that to the people behind the screen so that they can almost feel the love, literally, from the other side of the screen of me enjoying making music at that moment. And that's once the auditions stopped being this idea that I'm being judged for something or people are looking at me and being critical, and instead I prepared for months. I prepared for years from this moment, from my very first piano lesson, and now I'm going to make the best music I can possible for you. Then it almost felt like I was giving something to someone, like a gift. Most of the time when you give someone a gift, you feel good about it. And in my auditions, I actually started to feel good. I would smile in between phrases or in between excerpts, and I would have fun. And I almost wish some of the process could tell stories, because I probably had more fun than they're used to someone behind on the other side of the street having an audition. I'm sure they dealt with many nervous people, and I was still nervous. But again, the process was fun. I was making music, and that's what I was kind of made to do. And once I started doing that and not caring, then the success really started to take off, and I really hit my stride in the audition scene.
Ian Hallas also describes the experience of really going for it and making that priority number one.
It was a mental thing in terms of actually breaking that seal. I mean, one of the things I realized is that, and this happened to me in Atlanta, I had a couple of excerpts that an old me would have said it sounded terrible because it was a little bit out of tune. It was a little, I might have a little string noise, but the thing is, committees are going to forgive those sorts of little things if you're really going for it. If you're bringing care, like, for example, the battle scene in Hovnanian, if you're missing a shift or something, which you never want to do, but just to throw out an example, if you're missing a shift because you're in the moment and you're invested in what you're doing and you're really making the people feel like you're part of the orchestra and they can hear what's going on around them as they sit and listen to you, it goes a lot farther than just, like I said, checking off all those boxes and playing in tune and in time, because people understand that there's a next level to what you're doing. I do not advocate missing shifts. Right. But it's just if there's a little bit of string noise, people understand that it's forgivable. They're going to overlook something that happened that's never going to happen again, per se. The good should always outweigh the bad.
Learning how to handle nerves, adrenaline, and stage fright, that charged up state, regardless of how it's labeled, can make or break the audition. Chicago Symphony bassist Brad Opland talks about the issue of fear and how successful auditioners handle it.
I always think that, when you get to the level of, when you're actually competing for a job, at the college plus level or whatever you want to call that, that the real big issue is, in fact, fear. Mm-hmm. And it's the ability, the people who I've seen who are successful at making that jump to an audition are the ones who are able to harness that fear. And maybe in a psychological terminology, it's letting your fear guide you rather than rule you.
Matthew McDonald actually embraces this charged up state.
I've always loved the adrenaline rush of it. I've always loved the feeling of sweating, heart racing, that kind of feeling of not being totally in control. I always kind of liked it. I think you can learn to love it. I think at some point, when I was quite young, maybe even 18 or 19, I just decided just to love it. Just to be grateful for it, because I think the other side of it, the same coin, is that incredible rush you get from playing a great concert. And I don't think you can expect to have one without the other. So I think it's just best to make friends with it and find your way around it. But this is why when I practice, I make sure I know everything I'm doing. Because stuff will go wrong. But the more you know what you're doing, if you know just by looking, the bow has to be there and move at this kind of speed, there's only so much nerves can destroy. But the more you prepare, the less it can damage you. I leave room for spontaneity for sure. Not with Marlowe on solo. There's no room for spontaneity there. But with a lot of things, you got to leave some room. Because I find nerves are. I also find them very inspiring, and I also find I play better when I'm nervous generally. And I think if people can start to enjoy that side of it.
Houston Symphony principal bassist Robin Kesselman discusses how framing an audition as a type of recital can help, and how the audition has to be an act of musical expression.
I never played a perfect round, and I've never to this day played a perfect round. I don't think they exist, and also kind of not necessarily the goal.
Yeah.
Like I think this sounds like a bumper, like an inspirational bumper sticker, but I do genuinely not feel any different about my prepping and my performing of an audition versus a recital, except I don't get to choose the music, and they're very small parts of a whole, both like one voice of a whole and one small excerpt. But I think that is the most key aspect of audition preparation and performance is that, and having sat on audition panels here in Houston too, on several, it's a musical expression, and it's a little strange environment, and it's weird, and getting comfortable with the screen, but it has to be a musical expression and an artistic endeavor. And I think most also just in the fact that, look, this is something that everybody's going to do for probably a time measured in years, and that sort of makes it potable, but also exciting and fun and rewarding, artistically rewarding. So I don't think it's not a Scantron, it's like, we work in a field where you don't get jobs with Scantron tests or SAT tests or job interviews. I just think that even if you have to trick yourself a little bit, fool yourself a little bit, I think the more that one thinks of an audition like a recital, the better it's going to be for everybody involved.
Yeah. Your overall mindset can have a huge impact on your audition. Matthew McDonald and Robin Kesselman both talk about the difference between the mindset of making a mistake and the mindset of musical expression. Here's Matthew.
And also, it's not to take yourself so seriously. People are so worried about making a mistake. But what they should really be worried about is boring the poor people who have to listen to them. Like that's more life-shattering than slipping a note or two. So the main thing is to get out there and realize it's your show. No one else is going to play this. You need to entertain. You need to play. You need to tell something and play some music. No one's interested in your problems. No one is interested in your success rate today. It's kind of getting out of yourself a little bit, letting go of the ego a little bit, and accepting that the reason you're there is to tell a story. Unfortunately, no one's interested in how well it went in the lounge room yesterday.
Right.
But definitely not doing beta blockers. I mean, I think the only way is just to perform more. The more nervous someone gets, then they should play 3 times a week in public.
And here's Robin.
If you walk out and your whole goal is to play notes that are even and in tune, the second a note is a slightly different length than another note, you've officially nothing left to offer because your single goal has crumbled. Yeah. But if your goal is to make lines and make shapes and be expressive, and then one of your notes is like a little shorter than the other ones, in a kind of strokey passage, it's okay. It's like you're still completely fulfilling your purpose.
For nearly everybody, the first audition is not the one that lands them the big gig. Auditions are a continuum, and lessons learned from one audition can be carried over to subsequent auditions. Joe Conyers describes this process.
There's a letter that I still have in my bass box today, and that letter is my rejection letter for the Philadelphia Orchestra sublet. And I keep that letter with me because I was just on the other side of distraught for not getting on the list. But I always say, and I always tell my students this, every single time I take an audition, it's a learning experience, but 2, it's preparation for the next one. So I tell my students, never look at the today, never look at the audition at this moment, because these things are all a process of time. Instead, I focus at where I see myself at the end. As long as I keep striving for that, I will make the progress I need. And of course, I'm being honest with myself and I'm getting the right instruction and all that kind of stuff. I can make the progress that I need to get where I need to go.
Lyric Opera of Chicago bassist Andy Anderson has a valuable perspective on auditions as a form of education.
I don't look at auditions as merely a avenue to get employment. I also look at them as an education. In fact, it's one of the cheapest educations you can get. Each audition you show up, you pay, and you're forced to basically do a recital, sometimes up to an hour and a half long, like, for instance, Cleveland, of the hardest stuff for your bass. Some of it is you've got 2-octave shifts that happen in a microsecond, ridiculous stuff that you would never be asked to do in a bass solo even, that takes hours to woodshed. And the reason I never turn it down, even if I'm not prepared as well as I'd like, is because, one, I'm never going to be prepared as well as I like. So if I went by that, I'd never show up to an audition unless I was deluded and thought I was perfect, which I'm not. There's always a chance I'm going to screw up. So that's one thing. I always take the audition for that reason. Also, you learn something that they can't teach you at college. Your private lesson teacher can't teach you this. The only way you can learn this is by standing there in the audition situation, being unprepared, dealing, with, or being prepared, and dealing with what's going on in your head. Because your teacher can't see what's going on in your head. They don't see the frantic rat race that's buzzing around inside your skull and see the ping pong match that's going on, the little devil on one shoulder and the angel. No, don't think of that. Yes, think of that. That's all going on inside your head as you're getting ready to play. And you have to win that battle. But every time you're about to play the next excerpt, you have to defeat the bad guy and the good guy has to win. Each time I take an audition, it's worth at least 1 degree. I find out so much about what I need to work on, more than a teacher can tell me, because there's no arguing with an audition.
And former Indiana University bass professor Lawrence Hurst offers some additional advice on managing expectations for auditions.
And most people go to auditions, and naturally it is competition and so forth, but they feel so crestfallen if they don't make the cut or if they don't make the finals that it's devastating to many. It's got to be a little like going for a job interview, in the sense that once you do all the things you can do to prepare for whatever questions they're going to ask you, in the final analysis, it's up to them to decide if you're going to fit, not only to the organization, but to the ideals of the organization. If you go to an interview with IBM, and you come in a little scruffy and you don't know the answers to questions, naturally, they're not going to take you anyhow, because you're not even in their league yet. But if you come in with a suit and tie and you're dressed to the nines and so forth, and you got all the answers, that still doesn't guarantee they're going to take you. Just because you've done all the right things, just because you play it in tune and in time, they're looking for way beyond that. They're looking for a musical personality back there. They're looking for artistry. The best way to assuage the nerves and the jitters is to be prepared. At least if you're not satisfied you're well prepared, you're going to be nervous, period. You're going to be nervous even if you're convinced that you're prepared well enough. But the level of nerves will subside quite a bit as you play. But if you're nervous because you haven't prepared, that won't go away.
We'll close out this series with a clip from National Symphony bassist Ira Gold, where he describes the cycle of the audition process. It's a great zoomed-out perspective of the whole process and is a great closer for this series.
You just move forward, and that person then can become, just like me, a product of that process, and then they can then participate in choosing their colleagues at some point, if they have that opportunity. So it's like this cycle that we're all part of, And, you know, if you're doing it in a really profound way, it can be magical in a certain way, you know, that's like, even just remembering taking lessons with Ed Barker and him talking about auditions, or lessons with Paul Ellison, and, you know, both of them had lots of stories about auditions. And then this person played this audition, and it was incredible because they did this. You hear all these stories about things, and it becomes like folklore and legend. And, oh yeah, and then, you know, David Malone, when he won his Houston Symphony audition, he played his whole audition by memory. You know, like that's some legend that Paul would talk about. And it's like, but then that person gets in the orchestra, and then they impact the future, you know, like it's not just some great story. It's sort of like the audition is just a door that you walk through, and once you walk through that door, now you're in a new room. Now you're in your career. Now you're in the next phase.
My sincere hope is that this series can help people out there, like Ira described, to get to that next phase in their career, whatever that might be. And even if you never take a symphonic audition in your life, these skills of long-term preparation, managing nerves, and artistic mindset are valuable components of the creative experience and even the human experience. And in developing these skills, we're developing and bettering ourselves for whatever endeavors we choose. And so thank you so much for checking out this series, and I'd encourage you, if you haven't, to check out the complete interviews with these wonderful artists, all of which can be found at contrabassconversations.com. I'd also love your feedback on this series, and you can email me at feedback@contrabassconversations.com to get in touch. And finally, I'd encourage you to share this series. Share it with friends and colleagues, share it with students, share it with anyone you can think of that would benefit from hearing it. And all 4 of these episodes can be listened to consecutively on our website. Just visit contrabassconversations.com and click the link for the Winning the Audition series. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum. Contemporary Jason, again, jumping in here. And of course, everything I said throughout this series and at the end of that 4th part is true. Please share this with friends, colleagues, students. And if you haven't picked up a copy of the book, it is a whopping $5 for the digital version, $10 for the print version. And there is an Audible version. I have an audiobook version that is all linked up at winningtheaudition.net. And yeah, check it out. Let me know what you think. There's this content kind of transcribed and resynthesized, and it's about 50% new content on top of that, including a great conversation with Rob Knopper, percussionist in the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. And I said this earlier, I'll say it again, I have several great new conversations in the can about auditioning. I chatted with Carl Fenner of the Atlanta Symphony and Nash Tomey of the Kansas City Symphony, and they're both great conversations. Many more to come on the topic for sure. So thank you for checking this out. Feedback at contrabassconversations.com will put you in touch with me. I love hearing from folks. Please send me a message. It totally makes my day. I brag is kind of brag, but when I'm hanging out with my wife, I say, look at these wonderful messages. Look at how I get to spend my day, honey. I get to respond to people who are finding value in what I do. Such a privilege to be able to spend my time doing that. And it's just really an honor for me to have you listening to this. I hope you got something out of it, and definitely check out contrabassconversations.com/highlights. I'm going to be doing more series like these in the future. Thanks again. See you soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.